Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You may have noticed that this is our second Oasis of Dialogue event this month. But given the circumstances, we thought it was vital to have this discussion. We are grateful to be gathered here today, though we wish it wasn't under such dire circumstances. As we all know, Gaza has been the target of a particularly horrific onslaught once again. Gaza is 5 miles long and 25 miles wide. So just so we can get a mental image of how small that is the width of a morning walk and the length of a marathon. It's just about the size of Manhattan, 1/3 the size of Doha, and 1/4 the size of London. And it is this tiny strip of land where 2.2 million human beings have been illegally caged that has become the target of the most vicious aerial bombardment in all of human history. That is fact. That is not an exaggeration. In less than 2 weeks, over 15,000 tons of explosives have struck Gaza through Israeli ballistic missiles. That is the ton yield of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, despite Gaza being only a fraction of the size. But who are these people that are being the target of this horrific hellfire and demonic mass extermination? They are not soldiers nor combatants. They have no standing army and no defense system. Half of them are not yet teenagers. And nearly all of them are refugees or the children of refugees who survived the infamous brutal massacres that we all know of, that the Palestinians have endured and that have occurred all over modern-day occupied Palestine, and are now confined in what is increasingly being recognized as the world's largest and longest-standing concentration camp. While that image is bleak enough, it does not begin to scratch the surface of their reality. The vast majority of Gaza's population was born into this concentration camp, where 90% of the water is undrinkable, food is scarce, there is no work, there is no future, there is no hope, and there is no one to hear them screaming at the void of the international community as they are periodically targeted with precision missiles and snipers in what the Israeli occupation affectionately calls mowing the grass. Undoubtedly, the humanitarian catastrophe we have seen unfolding in Gaza for decades, which has now culminated into the most sadistic and frenzied mass extermination of the 21st century, is squarely the fault of Israel and those in the international community who have allowed Israel time and time again and enabled them to break countless international laws and violate the Geneva Convention with no consequences. On that note, the most important method of mobilizing to fight against this brutal occupation and this brutal oppression of the Palestinian people is by educating ourselves and arming ourselves with information. And that is why we are gathered here today, to learn. On that note, I would like to please welcome the video that has been prepared by the Qatar debate team on this matter before we bring on the panelists to the stage.
להרוס ולהתקדם, להרוס ולהתקדם, עם תותחים, עם הפצצות.
I'm telling the residents of Gaza, leave now.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, finish them. Finish them.
We're in a religious war here. I am with Israel. Do whatever the hell you have to do to defend yourself. Level the place.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
إسرائيل فرضت إغلاق كامل على غزة ومش راح يكون في عندكم كهرباء ولا مي بس دمار. بدكم جهنم راح تحصلوا على جهنم.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
That this fight and this war is a war between children of lightness and children of darkness.
Palestinians aren't killed by Israeli bombs. They die. Israelis, however, are killed.
Welcoming on stage our prolific panel for today. Professor Ilias Bantekas, a professor of transnational law at Hamad bin Khalifa University, an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University and senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London. He has advised international organizations including the UN, the COE, IDEA, OIC, and the UNDP and is regularly appointed as arbitrator in international commercial disputes. He has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed articles and 200 books, including international human rights law and practice. Additionally, we have Mrs. Laila Alarian. She is an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist, filmmaker, and an executive producer of Al Jazeera's flagship US investigative documentary program, Fault Lines, which recently received a News and Documentary Emmy nomination for writing for the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. She has more than 15 years of experience in multimedia journalism, including print, digital, and video. And our esteemed moderator, Mubarrat, is a debate instructor at Qatar Debate Center, in charge of the Qatar Youth Development Program, which is responsible for training the national team. He is a 3-time Asian champion debater and best speaker, as well as a seasoned moderator of our most pressing conversations. And joining us is Professor Helga Baumgarten. She is a political scientist, retired but still active at Birzeit University in occupied Palestine. She is the author of a number of books, the last of which is titled No Peace for Palestine: The Long War on Gaza, Occupation and Resistance. This book is in Arabic but will be translated within the next few weeks right here in Doha and distributed all over the Arabic world. Please join me in giving them a warm round of applause.
To start this discussion, Dr. Helga, may I start with you? We're in the middle of heavy bombardment of Gaza. On average, every 8 minutes, a child has died in Palestine since the bombings began after October 7th. And if you ask Israel or its supporters, they will say this is all Hamas's fault, right? It all starts on October 7th. But perhaps the conversation needs to be a little bit more nuanced than that. So to set the context, Dr. Helga, may I ask you to give to us the historical context that leads to this situation today?
Well, thanks
much for having me join this very important debate, especially today when we are witnessing the horrors in Gaza. You asked me to give a short historical background. Obviously, we need to start with the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip in 1967. And this is one very important starting point. The second issue, which is perhaps even more important, is the siege which Israel has imposed on the Gaza Strip since 2006-2007. As we heard in the introduction, Gaza has become the biggest open-air prison on earth. People have not been able to leave the Gaza Strip when they want to go out, when they need to go out, when they want to study outside, when they want to work outside. Obviously, unbearable conditions. Finally, as if all this was not enough, we have a series of wars against the Gaza Strip, or better, military attacks against the Gaza Strip, something I have been calling in my latest book the long war against Gaza, which started in 2006, 2007, then 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, 22. Now, finally, the second time this year, 2023. And we even need to go back further to 1948, to the beginning of a Nakba, when Palestinians were driven out by military force from their homes, and especially 80% of the people now living in Gaza have become refugees and were driven out by Israel from the area around the Gaza Strip in 1948. And we only need to read this fascinating book by my colleague, esteemed colleague, Salman Abu Sittah, in his book, Mapping My Return, where he describes in detail what happened to him and to his family and to the village where they lived, the house where they lived in 1948. Finally, to continue with the wars, what I call the long wars, the long war against Gaza, my colleague from France, Jean-Pierre Filiu, has counted from 1948 until 2014, altogether 12 wars against Gaza. You know, something absolutely incredible. There's another issue which we need to stress. All through this period, Israel, the state of Israel, has never been ready to agree to any peace proposal, either given by the Palestinians, from the PLO, from Hamas, or from the Arab world. Every single proposal was rejected, and in particular in 2008, 2012, when the leadership of Hamas in Gaza was ready for a long-term ceasefire, instead of accepting it, Israel killed the person responsible in Hamas, Shahada, and started a new war. So the context is one of continuous attacks against Gaza, of the creation of an intolerable humanitarian situation in Gaza, of the establishment of an open-air prison in Gaza, which, according to the UN, is no longer livable.
Thank you, Dr. Helga, for that context. Carrying on with that context, Dr. Ilias, unequivocally, the Western world has come out talking about the Hamas attacks as a terrorist attack. Hamas is labeled as a terrorist organization across the Western world, mostly. But what happens when a state commits acts that, most sane-minded people would say are war crimes, is a terrorist attack, right? We have seen the occupation is considered illegal. We have seen, verified by Human Rights Watch, the use of white phosphorus, chemical weapons that is supposed to be illegal. We have talked about collective punishment and how that's supposed to be a war crime. So what happens when Israel is doing this on the population of Gaza? What stands in the way of getting accountability for Israel in that regard?
I will not comment so much on Hamas because I think everyone agrees that at the same level where the crimes against Palestine, which are far more serious, are war crimes, crimes against humanity, even genocide. If it is true that what Hamas has done against civilians, these are also war crimes. That's undeniable. But at the same time, we see that Israel has effectively become an island, shielding itself from responsibility from every organization. So it's not party to any of the major human rights treaties. It has its allies to defend itself against any action it takes at the Security Council. And we just recently saw that it's completely isolated in the General Assembly, and even there it has some kind of alliances. So in terms of how accountability might accrue for Israel from a legal point of view, I think there is nothing absolutely that can be done because it's outside the realm of that. The only court available for Israel is a court of public opinion. And so we see that in Europe, the public opinion has been very low initially, and that's the reason because people were afraid. So even in my own country, people were told that if you went out with Palestinian flags or if you did anything of that nature, you'd potentially be arrested. And so, but now there's a change. The law can help in that by incremental steps. So one thing that can happen in Europe is a case can go before the European Court of Human Rights on the basis that people are denied freedom of opinion. And if that's successful, then that can change things slightly. But on any other level, there can be no accountability.
If I may just follow up on that. If I'm not mistaken, Palestine is a signatory to the treaty, right? So isn't it true that if crimes happen on their territories, right, even if Israel is not a signatory, they can be held accountable? And if that's the case, what are the actors, or why is it that mechanism is not availed at the moment?
Palestine is only a signatory, at least as concerns these last incidents, to the International Criminal Court statute. But in order for the prosecution to take place, and there's been an investigation, it's taken against, it's on both sides, but in order for there to be a real investigation, there has to be a prosecutor going on the ground with investigators, and that's not going to happen because of the absence of any authority from the Israeli government. Even Palestinians cannot get out, so it's impossible for an investigator to enter Gaza in any sort of meaningful way. Now, of course, investigation can start, but without people being actually charged and being present before the court. I mean, it's something, but it's not significant.
Right. Laila, I'll bring the conversation to you. You've written on fault lines, right? We've seen the story of the killing of Shirin Abu Akleh, but it's not been limited to that. Recently, we've heard that Israel is shutting down Al Jazeera's office. We've seen many journalists killed during the recent strikes. Ahmed Shahab, Mohammed al-Salhi. We've seen Wael al-Dahdou's entire family wiped out in a house that was supposed to be a safe zone. Would you say that is Israel deliberately repressing journalists, or would you buy into the claim that this is not intentional?
Well, we've seen and first of all, I want to say thank you so much for holding this very important conversation, and thank you all for being here. We've seen from the very beginning that sort of Israel's MO is when it bombs Gaza to actually keep journalists out. So we have the problem of journalists not even being able to be let in to cover the war crimes that Israel is committing against the people of Gaza as we speak. So of course we rely on the journalists in Gaza who are simply trying to do their jobs while also trying to survive. And as we saw in the video earlier, and as we've heard and we've witnessed the horror, this is a tiny territory with no fuel, no food, no water, electricity being cut out, and even communications being cut out. So these journalists are trying to work under the most, excruciatingly difficult circumstances. And according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 25 journalists were killed in Gaza. We've also seen the targeting of journalists in southern Lebanon a couple of weeks ago, in the killing of a Reuters journalist, Assam Abdullah, in an Israeli airstrike that targeted journalists who were visible as journalists. I do believe that those journalists were targeted because they were visibly identifiable as journalists. I think what disturbs and troubles me is that in any other situation, you would hear much more outcry among especially Western journalists if this many journalists were killed. We saw that Al Jazeera has been repeatedly threatened with its office and operations being shut down in Jerusalem and in the occupied West Bank, which would affect its operations in Gaza as well. It's one of the only very few international news organizations present in Gaza. And of course, the horrific killing of the family of Wael Dahdouh, who actually, listened to Israel's instructions to moved south, and were killed as they were sheltering for protection. On the same day that it emerged that Secretary of State Antony Blinken had actually asked for Al Jazeera to tone down its coverage. So all of this is extremely troubling. And if it were any other country that had killed that many journalists, I think there'd be far more outcry and a much, sort of bigger reaction in terms of what does it mean to protect journalists, to allow them to do their work, which is documenting these war crimes that are happening.
Thank you. Dr. Ilias, I'll bring it back to you. Since World War II, after the Holocaust, the world said never again, right? But it seems that from time to time we do revisit again. You've written about the Rwandan genocide. We've seen it happen with the Rohingya in Myanmar. What is it that allows a society to culturally accept, condone, even participate in such mass atrocities? Because from the outside, it's unthinkable, and when we are from the outside, we think it's impossible for our humanity to ever be part of a society that would be engaging in that. So what is it culturally that allows for a society to get to the stage where they accept and even participate in committing atrocities against another?
It's an interesting question, and I don't think there's always an appropriate answer for this. If we look at the Rwandan genocide, it started out of nothing. Of course, the system of differentiation between Hutu and Tutsi was made up by the Belgian colonizers. There was no racial distinction or any distinction of any other kind, but little by little, the propaganda by the Belgian authorities to kind of population to distinction between allies and foes created this dichotomy between the population. And so by the early 1990s, people could distinguish, although without any external features, between Hutu and Tutsi. We couldn't do it, but they could. And so when tensions heated up, the extermination was inevitable, and the propaganda kind of led to that. And we've seen that in also other cases around the world. How narrow-minded some people can be, and when they are this way, they can accept anything. And I think this would be the case in this scenario as well. Well, it's not the only way of justifying how things happen.
Would you say that there's a process of dehumanization that happens before people can accept, committing mass atrocities? Because with Hutus and Tutsis you were talking about, I believe the language of their cockroaches and so on and so forth was used. Is there something similar we see in Israel-Palestine issue as well?
So here we have a winning narrative, and the winning narrative is dehumanization. It could be something different, but dehumanization facilitates the process of killing and exterminating without having a stain on your conscience. And we see that. We don't understand it because these are upstanding people in every other way, but they have no problem killing this particular group and not any other group. You know, we would see sensitivities about other peoples, but not sensitivities against the group that's actually next to them. And that's the process of dehumanization, and it's the narrative that has won over everything else.
Thank you. Actually, that will connect me to Dr. Helga. You know, we have seen since the October 7 attacks almost a blind level of support from Western governments for Israel. We talk about the EU President Ursula von der Leyen, right? We have seen a video of her talking about how blocking of water and electricity is a war crime in no uncertain terms when Russia was doing it to Ukraine, and then now unequivocally, you know, standing up for Israel as Israel does the same. The Germany Chancellor Olaf Scholz, France's Emmanuel Macron, we've seen Rishi Sunak in the UK saying they stand for Israel no matter what. Keir Starmer justified the, you know, stopping of water and electricity before backtracking. Biden has given aid unconditionally. What is it and why is it that leads to these Western governments providing such unequivocal support for Israel in the face of these mass atrocities?
Well, I think this ties directly to the debate before. How can a society or a state reach a level of dehumanization of the other? I would focus here on the political aspect. What we are facing here is racist colonialism which has existed for hundreds of years and which continues to exist, in particular in the context of Israel-Palestine. In Israel, we have settler colonialism. This is a particular political system where the occupied, those oppressed, are considered inferior by definition. They are not accepted as human beings, meaning you can do with them whatever you would do. A friend of mine in Gaza said, if we were animals, animal protection organizations all over the world would cry out and help us, but we are in this racist colonial context not accepted as human beings. I think this is a very, very important aspect, and practically all Western Northern governments are part of it. My country, and I can only be ashamed of this, is playing a particular horrible role in this context. The second aspect, which we should not forget here, is the history of the Holocaust. Of course, again, Germany is responsible for the Holocaust. Now, if we jump from 39 to 40 and from the period of the Nazis, 33 to 45 to today, we have a situation where the state of Israel is using the Holocaust in order to present itself and its population as the permanent victims. And this is very, very effective in the attitudes and the policies better of Western government, and again, of course, in particular in Germany. If you're asked to stay on the side of your historical victims, governments are not looking anymore at reality, for other reasons also, but they are simply following this argument, you have to be with the victims. And just a note on the side, we still have in Israel 150,000 survivors of the Holocaust. Many of them are living in very poor conditions. And I've appealed not just once to the German government, instead of sending arms to Israel, send money to your victims whose families you killed and whom you kept in concentration camps for many years. A third aspect, which we also should not forget, is that Israel is for Western states, first and foremost the United States, but also for Europe, a very important strategic ally in the Middle East, in the Arab world, historically in order to control the free flow of oil to the West, and now in order to control any possible resistance against this ongoing colonial racist domination of the West.
Wow. I would actually want to flip the conversation to you, Laila, because we have heard about how the West perceives, people of the global South. Just a bit of background, right? So it's quite often that we also do see in the global South historically a sense of acceptance of inferiority sometimes, right? Justification of colonialism, even from people within the global South. Almost like, yes, the West always has the best forms of governance, better morals, etc. But perhaps, slowly but surely people get to see there is a sense of hypocrisy in terms of how the West moralizes. Would you say that seeing, as you would say, the masks of the West when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, is the perception of not just people in the global South, but say the immigrant populations living in the West who have moved there, lived there, and seeing what their communities are like, is that fundamentally changing the perception of people of the West and how they see themselves?
Well, I think it's important to talk about this conversation about dehumanization by critiquing the media coverage of what's happening in Gaza, which in turn forms people's narratives about the West, Western hypocrisy, Western media hypocrisy. And you see, to take a microscope to it, you see that, when October 7th happened was when US networks sent their star anchors all to Israel to cover it. So the violence begins and ends on October 7th. And you see that the narrative starts with always the Palestinians being the ones who provoke violence. It's never a response. It's always Israel responds, Palestinians begin the violence. You also see, even comparing Al Jazeera's coverage, Al Jazeera English in this case, and CNN, or Western media. For Al Jazeera, it's called War on Gaza. For CNN, it's Israel at war. So the perspective is always through the eyes of Israel. That's who the protagonist is. That's who the Western audience identifies with. You also see sort of a regurgitation from the very beginning of unverified and very sensationalist claims. So we see in the Western media this claim of Hamas beheading 40 babies without any evidence whatsoever, or Hamas committing mass rapes, again, without any evidence. You see it repeated by the President of the United States. And you see that this very sensationalist rhetoric has very dangerous consequences. So a 6-year-old boy in Chicago named Wadi al-Fayoumi was stabbed to death by his own landlord, a man who'd been listening to conservative radio, being fed this stuff about Hamas doing a day of rage in the US. So this has very dangerous consequences and a very real fear of hate crimes right now, akin to post 9/11. You also see wall-to-wall coverage of Israeli deaths, Israeli families and their experiences, and very little by way of what's actually happening to the people of Gaza. So if you're watching Al Jazeera and you're seeing these apocalyptic images of the deaths and destruction and children dying in Gaza, you would see maybe a fraction of that on US or European media. And what that does is contribute to this erasure, contributes massively to the dehumanization of Palestinian life and delivers the message that Palestinian lives simply do not matter and simply are not worth Israeli lives. You also see a reliance on Israeli military talking points. This is the same Israeli military that has a history of lying and misleading the media. Just to give you an example, in 2021, the Israeli media told the Israeli military told Western media that they were going to do a ground invasion into Gaza. The Western media printed that, and the Israeli media later admitted they did that for reasons of actually pushing Hamas fighters underground. They admitted we used the media for our purposes, we lied. We also see that with the killing of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Aqla. They lied and lied and lied. They said that it was a Palestinian who killed her initially. That was disproven. They said she was killed in crossfire. It wasn't until there were like at least half a dozen investigations that showed that she was actually likely killed by an Israeli soldier that they finally said, okay, maybe it was likely one of ours, but it was unintentional, even though it was a sniper who killed her in the very area that happened to be exposed between her vest and her helmet. So you see this history of the Israeli military lying, and yet the Western media kind of acting as stenographers, taking their word for it. And you also see the Israeli military and government setting the tone for the coverage. So for example, last week you had Western media all of a sudden questioning the death toll of Palestinians. And it's like facts do not matter, even though the State Department itself has said these figures are reliable. The United Nations, Human Rights Watch, all of a sudden you see the Western media saying the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, even though the Ministry of Health is actually funded by the Palestinian Authority. It doesn't matter, even though these numbers are compiled by doctors. And then you see that regurgitated by the President of the United States himself. So what does this do? It seeks to deflect from Israel's war crimes and change the conversation to raise doubt about the death toll, even though by all accounts it's likely even an undercount of what we think it is. And then of course you see this being framed as a war against Hamas, not a war against the people of Gaza, despite, again, the facts that so many children have been killed. They're bombing hospitals, homes, apartment buildings, mosques, churches. These are all civilian targets, and they're saying that it's the war against Hamas over and over again. And finally, the fact that journalists are not even allowed on the ground, and that's not something that they're protesting. Again, if it was any other country completely cutting them off from the story, it would be a huge point of outrage, but that's almost non-existent. And then, of course, you see the use of language. When it comes to any violence committed by Palestinians or by members of Hamas, it's referred to as barbaric, savage, murderous, horrendous, horrific. And then when it's Israeli violence, it's described in the most clinical terms: an airstrike, casualties, they died. You know, you never hear like who actually, even Reuters, when it was their own journalist, Assam Abdullah, who was killed, they didn't say it was an Israeli airstrike, they said he died. So you see sort of a lack of attribution when it comes to describing who's behind the violence. And I think what that means is that people are taking in this media, they're seeing the Western hypocrisy. This is not how you covered the war in Ukraine. In any other story you see, or most other stories, you see journalists actually reporting it out, trying to figure out the truth. You know, Christiane Amanpour of CNN says, be truthful, not neutral, right? But in this case, you see the media oftentimes, especially the Western media, acting as stenographers for the Israeli military and government and not acting as arbiters of truth, of actually wanting to get to the truth of what's happening. And of course, the suffering in Gaza is barely merits any coverage or mention.
If I may follow up on that, you talked about Reuters for their own journalists, refusing to have a strongly worded headline against Israel, passively worded. What does it feel like to be a journalist in the United States right now? We've seen journalists, a couple of them quitting because of the biased kind of nature of CNN, for instance. What must it feel like for a journalist who might be from, originally from the Arab region, but American by now, working in these newspapers, seeing their own organizations that's supposed to have their back, not even having the courage to simply say, yeah, it was Israel who, it's your employee, right? Like, how are people reacting to that? How are members, journalists of the Arab diaspora responding?
I think a lot of people are struggling a lot to work in these news organizations that they feel simply do not value Palestinian life equally to Israeli life. People are having a crisis of conscience. They're not sure if they should remain in journalism. I can't tell you the number of journalists working for newsrooms in the US and Europe who've reached out to me to tell me, like, we can't do this anymore. It feels so alienating. We feel like our newsroom managers simply don't see Palestinians as human. They have no interest in covering the suffering of Palestinians. Of course, there are many exceptions to that. There's very good work. I don't want to paint it all with a broad brush. There's still very good work being done. But I think in terms of the dehumanization, you really cannot de-link the narratives that are being propagated in the media, to politicians kind of justifying the mass killings of Palestinians, to even people, just watching it and sort of having a complete lack of context to what's happening. That's another important thing, is that there's absolutely zero context in much of the media coverage of what the people of Gaza have gone through the last 16, 17 years, and what the Palestinian people in general, what their life is like under occupation. But what that means is that it's very difficult to be a journalist in these newsrooms these days.
Thank you. Dr. Ilias, I'll bring it back to you. I just wanted your opinion on as Gaza is being bombed, right? We have calls from the Israeli side. Right now we're seeing them being asked to evacuate North Gaza. There have been conversations about, trying to displace them entirely out of Gaza, possibly moving them to Egypt and Jordan. Just from a legal perspective, when there's an occupier, are they not the ones who are supposed to be responsible for the welfare of the people that they are occupying?
True. There is a price that comes with occupation. You're occupying something, illegal or otherwise. There is a significant obligation on the occupying force, and that is to kind of replace the pre-existing government with itself and provide to the people whatever the other government would have provided. So one thing that they can do, for example, they can't change laws unless absolutely necessary. They have to take care of the population in exactly the same way as the regular government would have done, and that's not happening at the moment. Of course, Israel is trying to diffuse with some legal technicalities, for example, saying that after 2006, when there was a redeployment of Israeli forces from Gaza, that Gaza was absolutely on its own, and Hamas had taken over the government of Gaza, so therefore it had almost absolved its own responsibilities. That's not true at all, because when Israeli boots left the ground, their reliance on Israel was absolute. There was a complete air, land, and sea blockade. Nothing could go in and out without Israeli allowance for this to happen. Israel argues otherwise, but the situation is that everyone in the UN in the last 15 years have argued that Gaza is an occupied territory and that there was an obligation of the occupying power towards the population. Now, with that in mind, of course, the occupying power can take remedial action, police action, against, let's say, elements that are fighting the government. So if there is a state of occupation, then any, let's say, resistance to the occupier, although legal in itself, would be a crime under the law of the occupying power. And that's a risk that Hamas, for example, or anybody taking up arms against Hamas has. But this doesn't mean that the police action of the occupying power can be a siege, can be destroying buildings where population are living, civilians, simply because there might be a fighter that is resisting against the Israeli Defense Force. That's absolutely unacceptable. And that's why we see that if there's an apartheid before, and now it's not just, war crimes is simply a small word to describe what's happening. I think this is even beyond the crime against humanity, which is a very specific legal term. Crime against humanity is an attack against a civilian population, which is widespread or systematic. I think we've reached that level, and we've crossed it, and now we are at the stage of genocide.
Okay, I think that's very interesting, because there's a lot of conversation saying, you shouldn't use the term genocide lightly, because that's a very extreme term. That's not what's happening. It's targeted attacks. Maybe there's some collateral damage, but Hamas is hiding behind civilian casualties. So what makes you say, this is not to the point of crime against humanity, even perhaps genocide? What are the justifications for calling the bombardment of Gaza as such?
So we've established crimes against humanity, but genocide means destroying a group on certain grounds, or racial, religious, ethnic, and so forth, in whole or in part. So you don't need to try to target the entire group, wherever this may be, but if you target a specific part of the group in a specific location, that amounts to at least an attempted genocide, if not a fulfilled genocide. And here we see in Gaza that an attack means anything. It means from killing to maiming, but also to displacing. And we know that in the case of the Palestinian population, Gaza, it's not a great place to live. They're there because they didn't want to abandon their territory, right? And so by trying to force them out or kind of bottle them into Rafah, wherever they can go, and that's going to be the last resort. you're going to open up Rafah and they're going to leave, and then for the Israeli army will come in and take over Gaza eventually. And so that displacement, even if there's no killings, that displacement on its own, driving the entire population out of Gaza, that would be genocide just on those merits.
Thank you. Dr. Helga, let me bring the conversation to you. We've heard Laila talk about the media manipulation by the Israeli forces. We've heard about the possibility of complete displacement from Dr. Ilias. What do you think the ground invasion that has happened over the last couple of nights means? Because the IDF has released statements saying that it's only temporary. People have to move out from North Gaza and evacuate that. But actually, just yesterday, I was talking to a descendant of someone who was a victim of the Nakba, and their grandparents, when they left, they thought they would be back in a week, right? Given this situation, to what extent can we trust the IDF's assurances that the evacuation of North Gaza is temporary? And to be honest, even if it is not, what is left of North Gaza at this point?
Well, I mean, what we are witnessing, and we have seen some of the pictures, is a large-scale destruction of the Gaza Strip. And the demands of the Israeli army that Gazans should leave for the south is actually a crime in itself, because when people moved the first stage towards the south, the trucks going to the south were also bombarded by the Israelis, and many people died on their way. And once they arrived in the Rafah area, again, heavy bombardment started there, so that many people had no choice but to go back again. To summarize everything, the Gaza Strip at the moment is one single killing area where everybody, every single Gazan is under threat of being killed by the Israeli army. I just this morning, after 2 days when everything was cut off, got a small message from a colleague and friend of mine in the Gaza Strip, from Abed, who said, "We are still alive. We don't know if we will be alive tomorrow. We have cut down our consumption to half water, half of food, and we should not forget he has a little baby." Another friend of mine, Hanin, I know her since she was a little girl, is now about 21 years old, and she just had her first baby, Sanat. I don't have any contacts with her and with her father at the moment, so it's as the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philip Mazzarini, formulated, it's actually hell on earth, and all of us, especially in the West, have to ask ourselves, we knew and we know what's going on, what's happening. We are witnessing it on the social media, we are witnessing on all the media, and the question is, why have we not done enough to stop, again in his words, this hell on earth? The situation in Gaza, I think, cannot be described anymore in words. It just, makes you cry and yell out at the same time and say, how come that the United Nations, the Security Council first, and then the General Assembly did not vote in one single voice to reach a ceasefire, at least a ceasefire to save people from certain death?
Thank you. Laila, I'll bring the conversation to you. I think there's a bit of a opinion, like we saw in Al Arabi newspaper, Tahir Baraka was interviewing Khalid Mashal, the chief of Hamas. She was interrogating him saying, perhaps the Hamas's attacks on October 7 turned people away from the Palestinian cause. But yet we've seen, the stories that Dr. Helga just shared with us. We also see rising settler violence. This is not to diminish Hamas's attacks and indeed civilian attacks in any way, but how is it possible in the wider context? Surely it goes beyond just the media using euphemisms for such public opinion so drastically shift, given the wider context of so much more atrocities happening towards Palestinians.
So my great-grandfather was actually, he was a policeman in Lid, which is in modern-day Israel, in 1948. And when the Jewish Zionist militias came in May of 1948 to take over the land of Palestinians, during what we call the Nakba, or the catastrophe, they took my great-grandfather, they executed him, they buried him in a mass grave. 75 years later, Palestinians in Gaza are burying people in mass graves, including in soccer fields in Gaza. They are running out of body bags. They're running out of places to bury people. There are so many people who they haven't even identified yet. This is what the state of Israel has always represented to Palestinians, whether it's ethnic cleansing or genocide or occupation, complete and utter or apartheid, which is what Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International call the system of governance in the occupied West Bank. Complete and utter control of their lives and, land confiscation, settler violence. Even in just the last couple of days, we saw videos of mobs chanting death to Arabs, which will never make it onto Western media. We've seen settler violence escalate. They've now been emboldened in the West Bank, trying to remove Palestinians from their lands. We've seen attacks on olive farmers. This is now olive season. It's supposed to be a very happy time. We've seen even farmers being forcibly removed from their land. So this concerted effort to remove Palestinians from their land, to take their land, to confiscate it. Of course, we've seen the ramping up of buildings of settlements from 1967 on, to the point where the dream of a Palestinian state has completely been diminished. That there's no such thing given the facts on the ground. So with all of these facts in mind, the crowds speak for themselves. The crowds that are going out to say, no, this is settler colonial violence. This is the longest modern occupation of our time. This is a continuation of what the state of Israel has inflicted on the Palestinian people since 1948. That's what this is about. Despite Lindsey Graham telling us this is a religious war, of course it's not. Despite the congressman that I spoke to, when I said, Congressman, will you please, will you call for a ceasefire? People are dying, our families are dying. My mother lost 11 members of her extended family in Gaza. Will you call for a ceasefire? What does he tell me? They've been fighting for thousands of years. I said, no, sir, this started 75 years ago. And he turns to me again, he says, thousands of years. So this complete obfuscation of what this so-called conflict is actually about only serves to benefit the state of Israel and to enable it to continue inflicting violence on the Palestinian people with a blank check from the United States, its strongest backer.
Dr. Ilias, I'll bring it to you. We have seen efforts at peacemaking before, right? We've seen the Oslo Accords in the 90s when the PLO essentially agreed to just 22% of historic Palestine. And yet we didn't see eventually like Israel's commitments being fulfilled and America not really holding Israel to fulfilling its obligations. Even 2018, 2019, we've seen the Great March of Return, right? Where people of Gaza tried to peacefully protest and the IDF soldiers shot at them, right? There's a UN report that says they specifically targeted the ankles of protesters to cause permanent injury and damage. I guess I have two questions. One is, firstly, what are people supposed to do in that situation? What is the optimal way of resistance? And I guess the second is, if you are going to shut down peaceful forms of resistance and They're continuing West Bank settlements. Hamas is not there, right? So if you're going to continue shutting down peaceful resistance and unarmed struggle in that way, aren't attacks like October 7 predictable and inevitable? Because when people get frustrated, it is likely that they will lash out in some form or another.
From my own experience, collective consciousness as a Greek, for 100 years of occupation by the Ottomans, the acts of resistance by the Greeks were nothing compared to what Hamas did now. I mean, we used to, Greek fighters used to blow up places, themselves with ammunition, simply to bring about the largest kind of destruction that they could. And so I have an experience of that myself. If we look back in the 1990s, with the IRA, for example, we see that while the IRA was committing acts of, let's say, terrorism in the United Kingdom, going inside pubs, restaurants, and so forth, and killing innocent civilians, the United States refused to extradite these people back to the United Kingdom on the basis that this was a political offense. And so there's an exception to political offenses of people being extradited. So the US has a history of kind of selecting its own terrorists that it wants to have. And what's the reason? Well, because big Irish communities in Boston, and they would, if they were extradited, these people would turn against the government. So there's a real reason, a political reason, why you wouldn't extradite, those terrorists. Now, under international law, even if there was no right to, let's say, to use violence in order to achieve self-determination, even if there was no such rule, there have to be by practicality. Nobody stops you from fighting against your own rights. And that's why we have self-defense at the personal level. Nobody can stop that. Even if the law said you couldn't defend yourself, you would still, as an instinct, kind of try to defend yourself. And the same thing happens when a collectivity of people, when they're oppressed. And through the 1960s, 1970s, even during colonization, but even after that, there was this realization that the only way that self-determination could be achieved, at least in South Africa and Palestine, was through violent forms of resistance. And so violent form of resistance is something which is not outlawed by international law, but it's only restricted by the application of human rights and humanitarian law. And so Palestinian resistance can be violent, it can be forceful at several levels, but we see that because Israel is so powerful at different levels, this has no chance of succeeding. And one of the things about, which is sad that we see about Palestine, no one discusses about Palestine statehood. States can have this right to defend themselves in any other way, but the Oslo Accords did not provide a viable state for Palestine. I think it's not right to try and say that Palestine is independent, because if you do that, then you confine it to the unviable territory in the West Bank, in Gaza. There's no state in the world that's so fragmented as Palestine is, if it were a state. And I think that's unviable, and nobody should recognize that. Everybody should strive for a Palestine that's viable as a state, as any other state is, not fragmented.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Helga, would you like to chip in? What do you think people should be doing, maybe both inside and outside Palestine?
Well, I think it's always impossible to give advice as outsiders. I'm rather, as a political scientist and historian, watching and witnessing what Palestinians themselves are doing and have tried to do. I met myself a follower of Gandhi among the Palestinians, Mubarak Awad, at the beginning of the first Intifada, who was trying to establish a movement following the ideas of Gandhi, and the Israelis simply deported him. We do have in Palestine for many years now the BDS movement, a movement which is focusing exclusively on nonviolence, and it's shunned practically all over the world as apparently anti-Semitic, especially in my own home state here in Germany. Now, obviously what Palestinians have opted for all over the years, confronting the overwhelming violence even before the establishment of the State of Israel, and then since the establishment of the State of Israel, and in particular since the beginning of the occupation and the siege on Gaza, is resistance and resistance with arms. We have witnessed that in the Gaza Strip from several organizations, and we are witnessing it now, and especially in the last months, in the West Bank, where we have different phenomena. We have very young people, teenagers, not aligned with any political organization, who are simply, as we can read in Frantz Fanon's writing, who are exploding because they cannot continue under the conditions of such an oppressive occupation. They take up arms, shoot against settlers, against the army. And we have, of course, in the West Bank, both Hamas, and we have in particular in Jenin and in the Jenin refugee camp, the Islamic Jihad. And we should not forget, the context is very clear. We do have, on the one hand, ongoing ethnic cleansing in Masafar Yatta, south of Hebron, where people are continuously being driven out, and in the Jordan Valley, where especially Bedouin communities are forced by unrelenting violence on the part of the settlers, protected by the army, to drive these people out. And we have finally, and we should not overlook it, ministers in the present Israeli government led by Bibi Netanyahu, in particular Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are saying and formulating it very clearly. We are preparing a new Nakba. And recently, settlers distributed leaflets written in Arabic in one of the villages in the West Bank, saying a new Nakba is being prepared and you better leave before we are killing you. So the situation is unbearable, and against this overwhelming power, oppression and violence on the part of the army and the settlers, Palestinians in the West Bank do take up arms. What they do need and what they ask for is international solidarity on all levels, that people make demonstrations, put pressure on their own governments, so that finally at least one thing can be achieved: a ceasefire and humanitarian medical help for the people in Gaza. I think this is one of the very first things which needs to be done. And I think we are witnessing, not enough, but we are witnessing a lot of demonstrations worldwide in support of Palestinians and in an attempt to pressure their own governments to finally change their attitudes and demand strongly a ceasefire.
Thank you. Before we end this segment of the discussion, Laila, I will ask you for the final comments. Dr. Helga talked about, dehumanizing language of people like Smotrich, recently even so-called foreign moderate, politicians of Israel, such as Eli Cohen, has openly talked about the annexation of Gaza. But at the same time, it is true that we are seeing worldwide solidarity coming in from people across the world. And I guess it's really important that that flare doesn't die down, right? So what can people do? What do you hope to see from Palestinian activists, from people who want to be supportive of Palestinian activists? What should people be doing?
Well, I would say don't forget the feelings that you have right now. Try, if you can write them down, bottle them up, whatever it is you need to do. When we all think about the feelings that we have when we see these horrific videos, and every video that we see on social media has a story. Whether it's the little boy who took a piece of his brother's hair who passed away because he wants a piece of him, or the other little boy telling his younger brother to say the shahada because his brother was passing away, or the little boy we saw who's shaking, or the little girl in a tutu dress who's being pulled out of the rubble. All of these stories, we need to remember them. We need to put names to these faces. We need to archive them. We need to become smarter and more critical media consumers. We need to make our voices heard when it comes to the Western media and to hold them to account so that they're forced to do better. And there is a difference, especially on social media, when people use their voices to ask for better coverage. We need to support the good coverage that we do see and encourage more of that. In the United States, I know that a lot of the Arab and Muslim and communities, as well as younger voters, are really questioning next year's election and whether they can support Joe Biden again and kind of making their voices heard through the elections. I know that there's similar conversations in Europe and other countries. And just really, first and foremost, educating ourselves, because I think the pro-Israel side would like us to think that this is a very complicated or complex story. It's not. This is settler colonial violence. It's apartheid. It's genocide. We need to educate ourselves about it so that we can go out and inform and educate others about it and make sure that we make our voices heard in a very clear and compelling way.
Absolutely, thank you very much. We will move on to the Q&A section, but before we do so, we will show a video, and hopefully that also gives you time to think of some questions to ask to the panel as well.
This current situation that is happening in Gaza Strip right now made us look and see the real face of those international organizations and the Western media and this Western world that is always concerned with the freedom of speech. What's happening really is that we are seeing that the Gazans, the people of Palestine, not having their voices getting out there and reaching out the media in the most truthful way.
ما يقوم به الاحتلال هو القصف والضرب، وهو فقط يبرر أن حماس قد هاجمت، ولكن الضحايا ليس حماس، الضحايا هم المدنيين أو الفلسطينيين في غزة اللي ما لهم أي علاقة في الحرب.
And what it taught me is that a lot of people are misinformed and lack knowledge. Even Arab and Muslim people, they mean well, but a lot of people don't know the history behind what's happening. And unfortunately, a lot of people think this is a Palestinian issue, when in reality it's an Arab and Muslim issue.
The current war in Palestine had made me more aware about the double standards of the West. We have seen them violating international laws ever since 1947, such as using the white phosphorus, ethnic cleansing, the ongoing genocide that's happening, the killing of civilians and children, and yet we still didn't see any accountability.
What's called or advertised as freedom of speech is just a lie. And there's only one narrative that's allowed to go out, which is the narrative of the West.
If anything, this proves how hypocritical and corrupt the international communities are actually.
I follow a number of news sources, mostly on social media. I follow Al Jazeera, Eye on Palestine, which unfortunately has been taken down right now. I follow Subhi, Subh, and these are all really good sources that give you a lot of knowledge on the history of Palestine, and it also gives you a lot of knowledge on the current situation and gives you the reality of it. I also follow a number of journalists in Gaza themselves just to be up to date as much as I can on what's happening in Palestine.
We will open the floor up for questions now. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There's a couple of things. First, please let us know who your question is for. And second, we would rather not have the question, do you condemn Hamas? Okay, I see a hand up there. Could we get, and then I will come to you, and we will collect maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then we will get them to our panelists.
Hello. Hello. Hello, my name is John. I'm from Georgetown. I'm a student there. I have just 2 questions for Professor Ilias Bantekas. So you mentioned genocide earlier. Is that genocide in the academic sense or genocide in the legal sense? Because there are some terms that are in the academic world that could not be applied in the international legal world, like ethnic cleansing, for example. It does not exist in the Rome Statute in the ICC, for example. And I had the pleasure of attending a class with Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch, who told me that organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they have adopted the narrative of apartheid and as violations under the Rome Statute, but they have not really adopted the rhetoric of genocide. And there seems to be like a minority of human rights groups adopting that narrative. Do you think that there is a case to be made for genocide, violating Article 6 of the Rome Statute? And do you think these organizations should move towards it? And my second question is...
John, we're going to have one question
sure.
per person.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in front, in the front row.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. سؤال للدكتور إلياس، من خلال إجابتك على السؤال الأول الذي طرح حول موضوع إسرائيل وكأنها فوق القانون، ومن خلال ما تفضلت به الدكتورة هيلين تكلمت كثيرا عن الأعمال التي تقوم بها إسرائيل ضد العرب منذ 67 وإلى يومنا هذا. هل إسرائيل فوق القانون ولا يمكن لأحد أن يحاسبها؟ متى ممكن للعالم أو للقوى الدولية أن تحاسب إسرائيل حتى نخرج من هذا المأزق؟ متى ستبقى إسرائيل خارج السرب تغرد كيفما تشاء، يدها الطولة تصل إلى كل مكان في العالم؟ شكرا.
Don't worry, we'll have an interpreter translate that for you. And finally, could we have one? We'll go here for the first round of questions. For here.
What do you believe the international community could do to aid in the conflict? Do you believe that we should depend on awareness, or do you think that there should be more actions in terms of medical aid, financial aid, or in terms of the military and more defensive mechanisms?
All right. So maybe we will answer those questions first. While we get someone to interpret the second question for... Yeah, so you told him already? Amazing, excellent. Dr. Ilias, would you like to start answering the question regarding genocide by John, followed by the question in Arabic that I did not understand?
Okay. I don't think there's an academic definition of genocide and a legal definition. I think it's just the one thing. So we have this 1948 Genocide Convention, which was coined by a guy called Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish scholar, as a response to the genocide committed against the Jews in the Second World War, because there was no genocide convention. There wasn't even a crime against humanity at the time. So they had to coin something showing the magnanimity of the crimes and the people against which the crimes took place. So genocide is a real term, and we have genocide cases before the ICC, and we have them in other different courts and tribunals around the world. So it's there. Now, genocide is a very loaded crime, so nobody would prosecute that lightly. You need to have the evidence to show that there's been not only mass killings, mass deportations, but also with the intent of destroying that group in whole or in part. That's the difficult part. You can show mass killings, mass deportations, but can you actually show the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part? That's usually very difficult to prove or even disprove that this is the case. And to go to the second question, Israel is not above the law. And so if we have evidence of genocide, if we have all this thing happening, it doesn't have to go to the International Criminal Court. It can go to any court. Recently, there was something that wasn't really reported in the news all that much. The Dutch parliament failed to vote by almost 20 votes, 61 to about 81, that there is apartheid in Palestine. Is that reported? I'm not sure if it was. I just saw it on LinkedIn. Now, that shows that 61 people in the Dutch parliament are not afraid to show that apartheid, which is a very taboo term for Israel, for the United States, in Palestine. Now, if there's a reversal of that mood, then you can be sure that Dutch courts are going to use what is known as universal jurisdiction, which is jurisdiction to hold people liable for crimes taking place anywhere in the world. If a number of countries prosecute Israeli officials under universal jurisdiction, even if the officials are not there, then that does one thing. It prevents these Israeli officials from traveling to Europe And that's quite important for them. They can only travel to the United States, maybe somewhere else, but they can't travel to Europe. And Europe is a big part of Israeli trade. So that's a really good start. And we know that when the negotiating position of a state is decreased, then also its demand at the international level decreases as well. And I think that's what we're really trying to see, that a significant number of prosecutions, and that was against Ariel Sharon back 20 years ago, and he couldn't travel anywhere. And if we see that happening on a mass scale, then I think that will reverse the political climate.
Great, thank you. I believe the second question was open-ended, so Dr. Helga and Laila, I will leave it for both of you to answer. What can the international community do? Can they do? Is it just awareness, or is there something else that they can do? Perhaps Dr. Helga can start and Laila can come in.
Well, as I said before, we certainly need to do something, and I'm also convinced that we can do something. I mentioned before that demonstrations are extremely important, especially in this period where every second hour counts. We need to increase the level of demonstrations. We need to increase the level of pressure on our governments so that they change their position and at least agree to demand an immediate ceasefire. I think this is actually the most crucial thing which needs to be done, and I think a lot of this is happening at the moment, but as argued before, it is definitely not enough. We can also follow the action by the Palestinian American Association of New York. They placed a one-page advertisement in the New York Times, the face of a child, and on this face you have hundreds, thousands of children depicting what has been going on in the Gaza Strip. And we are presently working in Germany that also in major German newspapers we will be trying to make advertisements of this kind. But we need to speak out, we need to demonstrate, we may need to make pressure on our representatives, on our ministers, and obviously we need to write and to make lectures wherever we can. But again, as I said before, right now every minute, every hour counts, and there is not enough time to do something, and we can only hope that the pressure from UNRWA, from the General Secretary of the United Nations, from the Pope, for example, and hopefully much more will also come from the Arab world, that something is going to change. And this, I think, needs to be coupled and is coupled with what's going on in the occupied territories through the testimony of people living there, through their activities, through their interviews on the international media. And we do have a lot of people from Palestine, for example, Raja Shehadeh from Ramallah had the chance to write something in the New York Times. We have people writing in the London Review of Books. Again, it needs to be done as quickly and as forceful as possible because there is simply not enough time.
Laila, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what Dr. Helga said, which is immediately we need a ceasefire, not a humanitarian pause. A ceasefire, that's it. A humanitarian pause is akin to an abusive spouse stopping to beat his wife only to continue beating his wife. So it's useless. It's not going to help the people of Gaza. There needs to be an absolute ceasefire first and foremost. then there needs to be an appropriate amount of aid let in, because whatever they're talking about is a minuscule amount compared to what people actually need in Gaza to survive. And then the people of Gaza who've been extremely traumatized, I mean, entire families have been wiped out. In some cases, only one member of a family remains. I mean, they need help rebuilding. They need humanitarian aid. They need counseling. They need to be able to resume their lives. But what the people of Gaza themselves are asking for is for them to not only be seen as a humanitarian cause. They are asking journalists, please talk about the issues. Please talk about why we're here. Because we don't want to just be seen as a humanitarian cause. We're sick and tired of that. We're not, spilling our blood and dying for us to only be seen as a humanitarian cause. Please talk about the occupation. Talk about ethnic cleansing. Talk about the plan to move all of us to the Sinai Desert that Israel and the United States were trying to enact before they were rebuffed and pushed back. So what I would say is people should not take their eyes off of Palestine, whether it's Gaza or the occupied territories or Jerusalem or the West Bank, and keep talking about it, keep following it, and don't take your eyes off, like I said.
Thank you. We'll have time for one final round of questions. We'll start over here. Second row. Second row.
So as Dr. Helga has previously mentioned, there have been attacks on people living in the West Bank, even inside the 20% area that was given to the Palestinians after the 1990s. So when people in the West Bank are being attacked by settlers, and when they're encouraging settlers to be weaponized, and simultaneously Gaza is under siege, they're controlling everything, we never hear about the 51st article of the UN Charter, but on the contrary, now that the people are trying to do something to resist what's been happening to them for years, we now hear about this law and about this article and about self-defense. So why is it that self-defense is only a thing when it's done by Israel and not a thing when it's done by the people who are trying to protect what's left, what is 20% of their actual land? What is it with international organizations that scares them from talking about resistance as something people need to do to not lose what's left from their land? It's not an act of violence that is just arbitrary. It's needed because people are losing their houses and people are losing their lives.
Thank you. Second question over there. Third row. I'm being very inconvenient for Sire by moving him from one end to the other.
Hello. Yes, I have a question for Sir Ilias. I wanted to ask, in the face of the current events, we see the UN Security Council being unable to have the resolution pass because of the veto powers. Now, what we see here is that the whole UN votes yes, but there's this one veto power that's funding the genocide, but then it fails because of that one veto power. We see how Ms. Helga said that it was the bare minimum to for the whole UN in a single voice to have a ceasefire, to allow that to happen, but that cannot happen because of US that's giving the funds to a genocide. We see an imbalance of the power as well, and we also see that UN, sorry for my word, but it's very helpless. Even Antonio, the Secretary General, has been posting on Instagram, and he's helpless. He can't do anything. So as a legal advisor to UN and as UN in general, we as the youth, I don't think we want to live in a world where UN as a peacekeeping organization does not have any hold or power. Do you believe that there can be changes made to the Security Council? Because one veto power that's doing so much harm, being allowed to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Powerfully made point. One final question. And Because I can't see people at the back, I think there's a hand there, so yes.
Thank you very much. This is a question for our panel, but probably also Leila because of your journalistic background. Thank you for doing such a great job at really outlining the fundamentally colonial settler narrative that dominates the story and how it resonates obviously with Western audiences, especially in Europe, because Europe manufactured all the philosophies that led to settler colonialism in the world and so-called sciences and so on and so forth. So that has led to the dehumanization of Palestinians. There's one thing that I've noticed with this latest wave that is incredibly concerning to me, and my question is how does one counter it? And it's this narrative that Hamas is ISIS, and how that obviously really deepens the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. Obviously, factually, that's completely incorrect. I'm not going to get into details, but the two organizations are completely different in terms of their organization and their philosophies. I covered wars in Gaza, and I was in Mosul during the defeat of ISIS. I could tell you it was completely different. But most importantly, how do we counter that? Because this is very dangerous, because this gets to the heart of what's going to resonate with Western audiences in the 21st century. And it's dominating American airwaves. I mean, I've watched, obviously, Fox News, even MSNBC, CNN, and all you hear about is that this is about a military operation that's even more complex than Mosul, and Hamas is ISIS. It's a very difficult question, I know, but how do we counter that? Because it's completely incorrect, and it's only going to dehumanize the Palestinians more. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Actually, this is neatly divided into our three panelists, so we'll start with Dr. Helga. Dr. Helga, the question about the West Bank and why is it that the self-defense argument is only made when Israel does it?
Well, as everything in the world, the powerful determine what is being done, what can be done, and the way the world, we all look at it, how the media looks at it. So even on the legal level, Richard Falk the other day argued that even all the laws we are seeing, attacks against civilians and so on, are made by the powerful and not by the oppressed. So this is the problem we have to confront. And I think the only way we can deal with it is to repeat again and again, in the face of violent oppression of the Palestinians all over, in the face of settler colonialism, in the face of violent ethnic cleansing, the right to resistance as given to oppressed and colonialized people by the UN does exist, and it does exist for Palestinians. And all we can do is to repeat this again and again and again and again, and stress the conditions under which Palestinians live and the way they deal with the situation, and that in such a situation they very often have no other means but violent resistance against settler colonialism and against ethnic cleansing. I think this is really extremely important. And yes, I'll leave the Hamas question perhaps to someone else, or we might come back to it later on, as you wish.
Thank you, Dr. Helga. Dr. Ilias, the question about the UNSC and the veto powers, is the UN simply a toothless organization, or is there a way around Americans continuously vetoing resolutions?
We should make two broad statements. The UN is a successful organization in many respects. I mean, many things that we take for granted today are because of the UN and what it's done. And even the fact that we have a debate with the UN, an unsuccessful debate, but a debate nonetheless, that's a success. We need a forum. like we have a forum here. We need a forum, a global forum. That's a great global forum. And the discussion in the General Assembly kind of highlight the problem. I think it can only go better from there. But the UN and the Security Council is like any other house. There are good parts and there are bad parts. And so we see in the developing world that when the police, let's say Nigeria, when the police cannot help crime, or from gangs and so forth, the people get together and they fight the crime on their own. And what I'm trying to say with that is that the part of the UN that doesn't work, like-minded people can take a situation in their own hands. And just to play devil's advocate, where is the OIC here? Organization for Islamic Cooperation. Where is the Arab League? What's the united stance of the allies of Palestine? We see none of that taking place. So I think it's, criticizing the UN is great, but we know what's there. It's not going to change. So we need to find alternative ways of addressing the issue. And if the UN doesn't work, well, there has to be something more alternative that should be done. I said this a few days ago that during the blockade, Qatar spent $1.5 billion against the UAE and Arab narrative, and it won. Based on all of that, it won the battle, won the narrative with, by showing the West that it had the right argument. I think these initiatives show us that there's a narrative that needs to be taken and an argument that needs to be won. It may not be the UN, but something else, and that's where the game should be played.
All right, thank you. And finally, Leila, a question of how to counter dehumanization specifically between the Hamas-ISIS question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I've definitely seen the US media pick up on that. Again, not every news organization, but many of them. And it's, of course, playing on deeply Islamophobic tropes. These two organizations have very little by way of, what they have in common. But this is, an Israeli talking point, or some Israeli PR company came up with it and basically distributed it to these news organizations, which are taking it full on. I think it's a tricky question because it's assuming that these news organizations are operating in good faith and that they actually want to learn and be accurate. And I think oftentimes they're operating as propaganda arms for Israel. In terms of how do you counter it, I think it's just dealing with facts. The fact of the matter is most of the victims of ISIS were fellow Muslims, whether it was in Iraq or Syria. That's most of the people who they were killing. Of course, in the situation of Hamas, it's an indigenous movement that sprung up to oppose the Israeli occupation. So just really taking things down to facts, like these are the facts of what's happening, and also pointing out the fact that Israel has always had a boogeyman to point to, whether it was the PLO or the PFLP, now it's Hamas, in the future it'll be something else. But what has been consistent all along, it's resistance to the occupation, it's resistance to apartheid, to ethnic cleansing, to genocide. It's wanting to live in freedom and dignity, and really trying to reframe the conversation as much as possible. But when you're dealing with racist intentions and racist tropes, it's oftentimes impossible to deal with facts or change their minds. It's just about reclaiming the narrative and sort of countering the narrative with facts and truth, and hoping that in the end that will prevail.
Thank you very much. I think when we conduct the Oasis of Dialogue, quite often we are very excited about the solutions proposed, etc. This conversation has been, unfortunately, in a very unfortunate time for Palestine, which meant that perhaps the mood in the room is one where all of us are not as excited as we'd usually be. But nonetheless, I think it's very important to listen to what you guys have talked about, that it's at this very moment that it's super important that everyone make sure that they don't let go of that fire, that they act very fast and not wait for something else to happen. And hopefully there's a ceasefire very soon, and hopefully Palestine will be free soon. Thank you very much. Have a good night.